Okay, how to make an online multiplayer game using Unity Photon Bolt. So the first thing to do, as with any Unity project, is just to make sure that you've got Unity installed. I like to use the long-term supported version, so this one here, but it's really up to you. It doesn't really matter that much, and you should be able to use any version for the sake of this tutorial. Next thing to do is just to go ahead and create a new project. Please don't mind the names of my existing projects there. We're just going to go ahead and create a 2D game here for the sake of this tutorial to make the game as simple as possible. Keeping in mind that the intention of this tutorial is just to make a really simple multiplayer game, not to make any kind of particular game, really just something that is multiplayer that you can take and apply to your other or existing projects. I'm just going to call it Simple Multiplayer. Obviously you can call it whatever you like. And just creating it now. Okay, now that Unity is loaded, the next thing you want to do is make sure that you have imported Photon Bolt, which is the framework that we're going to be using to make our game multiplayer. Okay, so now that we're in Unity, just go ahead and open up the Unity Asset Store. Once that's loaded, go ahead and search for Photon Bolt. Okay, so for today we're just going to be using Photon Bolt free. I actually haven't experimented with any of the other versions of Photon, but there's a couple of other options that you can choose from. But for the sake of this very simple online multiplayer tutorial, Photon Bolt free is going to be absolutely fine. So once you're here, you can go ahead and download it. Just wait for that to finish. And then you can simply import Photon Bolt to your Unity project. So really all of this stuff should be fine. Go ahead and import. Okay, first thing that's going to happen once you finish importing Photon Bolt is that it's going to give you a setup wizard. The next thing to do is to follow this wizard through so that you can effectively set up your Photon account so that it's easy to host online games using their service. So not much to read here. Just skip through all of this. You will need to set up a Photon Bolt app ID. You can also assign a region here because Photon has servers in many different places. Or you can just go ahead and choose best region, which will choose a region based just on your ping, your latency. All right, so once you're on the Photon website, you have to create a account unless you've already got one. And I'm just going to go ahead and sign in now with my account. Okay, once you've got an account, you're going to be on the Photon dashboard. Here is where you can create a new app, and you can get your app ID, which you can then plug back into Unity. Once I'm in here, I can create a name, Simple Multiplayer, Photon Bolt, and a short description if you want it, a URL if you want it. Once it's created, I can go into that game that I've just created. Once I'm inside the game, I can now find my app ID here, which I'm just going to go ahead and copy. I can come back to the setup wizard. I can paste that in there, and then I am ready to go. Next, I only need the core package. I will not need these samples, so I can skip that, and then we are done. Bolt is going to need to compile the assets. This is something that sort of happens again and again with Bolt, something you're going to notice whenever you make a change or you add a new prefab. So we can just go ahead and accept that and go yes. Okay, so now you're going to notice that we have this new menu up here, which is the Bolt menu. From here, we can do a couple of pretty cool things, as well as a few very, very important things that we're going to learn very soon. Okay, and just in case the wizard didn't run automatically, you can go up here to Bolt, and you can click Wizard to run it yourself manually. The next thing to do is to make sure that Visual Studio is linked to your Unity so that autocomplete and IntelliSense works as it should. To do that, go Edit, go into Preferences, go up here to External Script Editor, in External Tools, and make sure that Visual Studios 2019 is ticked. The other thing to make sure is that you're using the Bolt window. To do that, go up to Bolt, click on Assets. This will create this window, and I just like to add it down here so it's easy to get to. This has the states in it, which is going to become really important later on. This is what we pass around over the server and clients. Okay, now that we've done that, we can go ahead and create a really basic interface just for creating clients and creating servers. Right-click this window over here, go UI, and create a canvas. Now what I'd like to do here is change this render mode from screen space into camera, drag the camera over here so the camera and the canvas are 1-to-1. After that, we're going to go ahead and create a couple of buttons. Create the first one, which will be the button for creating the server. Control D to duplicate, and the second button can be for creating the clients. Now I'm just going to go ahead and spread these out so it's a little less clustered, and just add a little bit of context to these buttons. So create server, and create client. Perfect. So now that we've created some buttons, we're going to go ahead and add some functionality. Come down here to Assets, right-click, and Create Folder. We'll call this folder Scripts so that things are nice and ordered. Go into that folder by double-clicking it, right-click, Create, C# script, and we'll just call this one Menu. Perfect. Now if we double-click Menu, we can go ahead and open it up in Visual Studio's Community. Perfect. The first thing to do here is to change what we're extending from mono behavior to global event listener. Go ahead and hit Alt-Enter because we haven't imported this, and select Bolt Global Event Listener. Perfect. Okay, next thing to do is to make sure we can access the buttons we've just created. To do that, we're going to go public button, create server, lowercase c, and public button, does that, join client. Again, Alt-Enter, and make sure you select the Unity Engine UI. Perfect. Now that we've created those buttons, we can go back here. We can drag our menu script onto the main camera. And we can drag Create Server button into the Create Server spot, as well as the Create Client button into the Join Client server spot. I actually made that just a little bit incorrect. I had intended to make that called Create Client. There we go, just a small amendment there. Okay, the next thing to do is to add listeners to those buttons. To do that, we can go create client dot onclick add listener. We can also do that for the server by going copy paste and create server. Onclick add listener. Of course, we need to create some functions for these, so we'll go void create server. And you probably guessed, void create client. Perfect. Now that we've got these, we can make sure they actually call them. So this is create client, and this is create server. Just cap these off. Perfect. The next thing to do is to make this function do something. To do that, we can go bolt launcher dot create dot start server. Empty parentheses. Save that, and probably guess this one too. Bolt launcher dot create start client, that is. Okay, perfect. We can test that functionality now by going back into Unity, making sure we save with Control S, and then clicking play. Okay, something I noticed is I hadn't actually linked to the create client, so to do that, you just go back here, click on the main camera, notice the menu, and then pull that over there so that create client is where it should be. Now if I hit play, I can create server like that, and you'll see we get some information from Bolt, just letting us know what it's doing, as well as I can create client like that. Perfect, so that's working as it should. The next thing to do is to make sure that the client is actually connecting to the server. Okay, now that we're starting a server, we also need to create a session. To do that, we're going to override one of the global event listener functions, which is going to be bolt start done. This function's straight from the Bolt documentation, so I will actually just link a lot of this code as well on the Discord. So if you just want to go through and copy and paste some of these scripts, that's totally fine, and you'll be able to access it just in the Discord. It wouldn't make sense to put it in the description of the video, but it should be really quick and easy to find regardless. Here we're going to remove this. We're going to go if Bolt network is the server. If we're the server, create a session. We need a match name, and the match name needs to be unique. To make a unique key for this, we're going to use a GUID generator like that. Okay, now we just need to create the session. To do that, we can go Bolt matchmaking, which we'll need to import, which is Alt-Enter again, and then create session. Inside of our session, we need a session ID, which is going to be the GUID we just generated, and we also need a scene to load, which at this stage will just be our sample scene. Just remember that you'll need to update this if you change the name of the scene, or if you want to load a different scene when you are creating your session. There we go, nice and easy. Now we are creating a session. The next thing then to do is to make sure that we can join the session. Just going to move this down a little bit, just as a little bit of, tidying up. Control X and Control V. Underneath this function, we're going to override another global event listener function, going public override session list updated. There we go. Just getting rid of this again. And now we're going to loop through all available sessions in the session list. To do that, we go for each var sessions in session list. See. UDP session Photon session equals session dot value. If Photon session dot source equals UDP session source dot photon. And that instance, Bolt matchmaking again, join session. Of course, the Photon session. And there we go. We should now be able to create and join sessions. The next thing then to do is to create our first Photon state. To do that, we're going to go over here to the Bolt Assets window, back here to the states, you can right click, and we're going to click New State. New State should generate this window here. We can call this state something appropriate. I think I'm just going to call it the player state, because that's what we're going to use it for. Got to create a new property, and these properties are what we're going to pass around in regard to the state. And for the sake of keeping it really simple, it's just going to be the player's position. You notice right now it's a float. A float doesn't really accurately show a position, so we're going to change that from a float into a transform. Now we've added one property here, but we can in fact add as many properties as we want, and you can hand around any of these things here when it's appropriate. In this instance though, transform should be more than enough. So go ahead and save that. We now have our first new state. Something you want to continuously do with Bolt is make sure you go up here, you go compile assembly, and this is just to update player state. Okay, so I've actually accidentally created a second player state here. It looks like there was already one called this, so I'm just going to call this player position state instead. Save that. And now go back up here, compile assembly, so that Bolt can update the states that we can hand around easily. Perfect. The next thing then to do is to create a prefab for our player. I'm just going to keep this really, really simple because I think I'm running out of time. I'm just going to go up here to create, down to sprites, and I'm going to click square. This will create a sprite. Right now it's in the scripts folder, which isn't right, so I'm just going to push it back into the assets. And then I'll drag my square onto the scene, rename it to player. Then I will open up Photon, Photon Bolt, Resources, and inside Resources I will drag player down so that I can make it into a prefab. After that I can delete it from the scene since we'll instantiate it when we launch the client and the server, and now we can make changes to the player here. Now in order to pass around the transform and the state that we just created, we need to add a component, and that component is going to be a Bolt entity. At the moment it's kind of freaking out because we're not passing any kind of state to it, so we can change that state to the state we just created, which is going to be player position state. There we go. You see there's an error here too, which is just that we don't have this prefab, and that is because we need to recompile in order for Photon to pick up that we've put a new prefab in the resources folder. So we just go back up to Bolt, go compile assembly, or update prefab database. I think you've got to do both, so I'm just going to quickly do compile and then update. And now you see that the Bolt entity is happy to accept that we've created this prefab player, and it's there inside the resources folder. Now we've got prefab for the player, and then we're creating and we're joining sessions. We can go ahead and create a player when we launch. To do that, we're going to go back to our scripts folder. We're going to right click, we're going to go scripts, and we're going to call this one create player. There we go. Now in order to run this script without actually putting it on the scene, got to go up here, got to make sure that this inside square brackets is Bolt global behavior. Now we can look at instantiating the object. To do that, we go Bolt network instead of the regular Unity instantiate. Since it's a Bolt object, we go instantiate. We can go Bolt prefabs. Whoops. Bolt prefabs. And since we've generated our new prefab, the prefab now should be here as player. Now we just do a position, same as normal. And for the sake of this video, we will make this position 0 and 0. and the transform rotation, the default rotation. As well as doing it in the start, I'm just going to make sure that it's happening by doing an override, which means we're going to have to go ahead and change what we're extending up here to bolt.global-event-listener. And then we're going to extend the scenes load local done. Inside of this function, we're just going to make sure we're instantiating the player again. I don't think it actually needs to be done this way. This is just how I did it a second ago, but I think you can actually just instantiate it the one time. This is just to make sure, once when we start the script, and once when the scene is loaded, just in case the scene reloads with an additional client. I believe this is considered obsolete, so we're just going to go ahead and Alt-Enter and add the system's obsolete tag. Now that we've done that, we should be able to see that when we start the game and we start a server or a client, we should instantiate a prefab for the player. Create server, there we go. And create client, there we go. Perfect. The next thing to do then is to make sure that we can actually do something with that player, that we can move around. Again, I'm just trying to keep this as simple and quick as possible. So of course you can do whatever you like to your game. You can make your player shoot things out. It's all going to be exactly the same as far as the states and what you're passing around. So with this tutorial, you should be able to take it and do whatever you like. It's also worth checking out the documentation just so you can figure things out a little bit more. I think this tutorial, it really just is a how to do things, probably not a how things are working. So definitely better off to go back to the documentation, have a look at the things that are said there, and make the changes that you think are appropriate. But for now, let's do some really basic player movement. Back in the scripts folder, we're going to go right-click, C# scripts, and we're going to go player movement. Once that's created, we can double-click it again to open it up in Visual Studio's community. Something important now is to make sure that only the player that instantiates the object has the authority to move the object. To do that, you can go ahead and extend bolt's entity behavior. And specifically, player position state, which again is the state that we added just a few minutes ago. I'm going to start off by overriding the function which is attached. Again, we can get rid of this, and we can make it so that only the state.setTransform state.position.playerPosition, which is the name that we gave it, updates the transform. There we go, and so here we are extending the entity behavior iPlayerPosition, which is the state we just created, and specifically the property of that state is the player position. Okay, now we just need a way to move. I'm going to make this really simple and just shift the transform of the object. I'm going to go if input, get key, key code, W, and then shift the object up by going transform.position equals new vector 2, which will be the transform.position.x and the transform.position.y plus 0.1f. And we can multiply this by the bolt network frame delta time. There we go. We'll do the same thing for each other direction. W being up, S being down, A being left. Just go like this. And of course, D being right. Quickly save this script. Attach it to the player prefab. And we should now be able to move the player around when it is instantiated. Just test that out now. And lo and behold, we can move the player around. Perfect. Now the last thing to do is to test that our game is in fact multiplayer. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and build the project by going File, Build Settings, Build, saving it somewhere that makes sense. It doesn't really matter where you save it. I'm just going to save it here into this folder I've created called Test Builds, and then let Unity compile your project. Now that that's compiled, I can run the compiled application here, as well as I can run the local editor version here. I'll go to the version I've just run and I'll create a server. Notice that it creates the player object. I will then switch back to the editor and I'll create a client to join that server. Now if I move this object, you notice there is two players, one for the client and one for the server. I can move my object this way, and that should be replicated on the client, and it is. In virtually real time. And there we go. We now have an extremely simple multiplayer game, but hopefully the framework for any kind of changes that you'd like to make to your game, or you can continue to iterate on this project and add anything you like. I'm going to go ahead and add the code for this project to my Discord, so please come and check it out if you're really curious or you just don't want to type all this stuff out, which I totally understand. And also feel free to jump out and ask for any kind of help on the Discord. I'm normally around, or at least most of the time, maybe not between 9 and 5, but always happy to help. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you want a video about anything else, or if you want me to extend this to add some game mechanics. Happy to take suggestions. Thanks.